And now here on Radio Free UK, we have an episode of the Liberty Nation podcast from Radio America. This is very much the sort of podcast I'd like to be hearing here in the UK, if someone had the time to actually make it. The first part is an interview with an expert on radical Islam, and in the second part, Chewing the Fat, it covers other US constitutional matters. Several issues that UK libertarians would do well to take note of.
The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner, cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So this is what they expect us to believe. Hillary Clinton and her presidential campaign expect us to believe that a meeting between Bill Clinton and the Attorney General of the United States had nothing to do with the two criminal investigations into Mrs. Clinton and her family foundation. Welcome back into Liberty Nation, and we'll lay out for you today all the claims of innocence being made by the Clinton campaign and the U.S. Attorney General, all the things you'd have to believe are true to accept that innocence in the wake of revelations that Bill Clinton held a secret meeting with the chief law enforcement officer in the country and the woman who will decide the fate of his wife, the presumptive Democrat presidential nominee, when the FBI is done with its two criminal investigations of Hillary Clinton. In the wake of yet another terrorist atrocity at the biggest airport in Turkey this week, we'll examine the claim that radical Islam is apart and different from mainstream Islam, when we're joined by Brigitte Gabriel, national security and radical Islam expert and founder and president of Act for America. In Say What, how the left-wing media is doing its part to overturn the Brexit vote, how Donald Trump is breaking with Republican tradition in his economic policies, and on what we call enhanced interrogation techniques. Plus, we'll review trending topics and stories affecting your liberty as we chew the fat with Scott Cosenza, constitutional lawyer from One Generation Away, on the web at onegen.org. That's ONEGEN.org. Now, when the framers of the Bill of Rights placed freedom of the press in the very first amendment to the Constitution, they did not envision the kind of press we mostly see today. Partisan mouthpieces with thinly veiled political agendas, mostly progressive, leftist agendas. What they did envision was the kind of journalism exercised by the TV station ABC 15 in Phoenix. Because if reporters from that local TV station hadn't kept an eye on the Attorney General during her visit to Phoenix on Thursday, while the mainstream media was looking elsewhere, the world would not know that Attorney General Loretta Lynch slipped away for a private meeting with the 42nd President of the United States and husband of the woman under investigation by Lynch's own FBI, right before the release of the final report by the House Benghazi Committee and before the FBI finishes its twin investigations into Hillary Clinton's use of a private survey, mishandling of classified and beyond top-secret information, and the Clinton Foundation, which was accepting massive contributions, hundreds of millions of dollars, while her husband similarly accepted massive speaking fees from numerous foreign countries while Hillary Clinton was in charge of policies towards those very countries. So, of course, they claim this meeting between Mr. Clinton and Loretta Lynch was perfectly innocent. Nothing to see, just old friends catching up and having a nice innocent chat. And in order to back that up, they expect us to believe a string of assertions that the Clinton campaign and Lynch herself have made since that meeting. They expect us to believe the meeting was spontaneous, completely unplanned, like the Attorney General and Bill Clinton have, a ton of free time in their schedules to freelance, take an unplanned meeting in a private jet on an empty tarmac. They expect us to believe that Bill Clinton just happened to be at the Phoenix airport at the same time as Loretta Lynch and had plenty of time to take that spontaneous meeting. According to a law enforcement official familiar with the matter, the former president saw Lynch's plane on the tarmac and walked onto her aircraft, and they expect us to believe Bill Clinton had no advance knowledge of Lynch being on the same tarmac in the same airport. They expect us to believe what Lynch says Bill Clinton told her, that he was in Phoenix playing golf when it was well over 100 degrees in Phoenix. Everybody knows you can hardly walk outside in Phoenix in July. And that Bill Clinton, of course, suffers from a heart condition, but he was playing golf, according to him. They expect us to believe what Loretta Lynch said, that in her 30-minute meeting, she only discussed their grandchildren and stuff about their travels and the news of the day. They expect us to believe the grandchildren talk, even though Lynch has no grandchildren of her own. They expect us to believe that it's perfectly all right, just a bit awkward is all, for the Attorney General of the United States, with the outcomes of 2 criminal investigations into the presumptive Democrat nominee pending, to just go ahead and meet with the woman's husband, who happens to be a former president, who happened to appoint Lynch to the prestigious U.S. attorney position in the Eastern District of New York that served as the springboard for her to eventually ascend to U.S. Attorney General. They expect us to believe that Bill Clinton said nothing to Lynch about those investigations or reminded her of where her bread has been and will be buttered. Not that he would really have to say anything explicit. The message is pretty much crystal clear, with hardly a word being uttered. Wink and a nod is pretty much all it takes. They expect us to believe that no way did Bill Clinton offer Lynch anything like that she could continue on as Attorney General if Hillary's elected, or that she might be on the short list for the Supreme Court, or that the Clinton Foundation could make a nice, fat contribution to whatever organization she lands at. No, nothing like that. Yes, they expect us to believe that this meeting was entirely spontaneous and entirely innocent. Of course, now that the Attorney General was outed on this meeting, we're now being told that she will not have any hand in the decision on whether to bring charges or indict Mrs. Clinton. That it will instead be decided by career appointees and not political appointees in the Justice Department, as if that would make any real difference. They expect us to believe all of this in the wake of a Benghazi report that confirms what we pretty much already knew, that Hillary Clinton knew for sure Benghazi was a terrorist attack on the night of the attack, but continued issuing public statements she knew to be false, as were others in the Obama administration, including the president, that the attack was because of an online video. They expect us to believe them, even as she told bold-faced lies to the families of the Benghazi victims about the cause of the attack. They expect us to believe them in the wake of Hillary's flagrant compromises of national security, in the wake of a private server designed to do an end run around those prying eyes of the government, in the wake of her stream of lies about releasing all of her emails when she was cornered. They expect us to believe them when her family foundation was accepting hundreds of millions of dollars from foreign governments while she was Secretary of State, a prima facie, on the face of it, flagrant, textbook conflict of interest. They expect us to sit still and refuse to say this meeting by itself disqualifies her from the presidency, that her one-finger salute to the rule of law now being investigated by the FBI disqualifies her from the presidency, that making policy for governments throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at her family foundation disqualifies her from the presidency. The Clintons are long past the point where they deserve any benefit of the doubt. This meeting is just further proof of what we've known for the longest time, that the Clintons will do anything to gain power, in this case, explicitly or more likely implicitly, threatening the Attorney General of the United States and thinking they could get away with it because the media wouldn't find out, and because they've always gotten away with every scandal they've ever been in the middle of by delaying, stonewalling, and then telling a compliant media to move on. And if it wasn't for ABC 15 in Phoenix, we wouldn't even know about a secret, illicit meeting that reveals everything you would ever need to know about Bill and Hillary Clinton. We'll play you what Loretta Lynch said and how the media reported and reacted to this meeting, which was supposed to be secret, a bit later on in our Say What segment. But, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. But, go ahead and vote for Trump. Vote for the libertarian Gary Johnson. Write in a name for all I care. Or don't vote at all before you even consider pulling the lever for a woman who just provided even more evidence, as if we even needed more, that she is the most thoroughly corrupt person ever to seek the highest office in this land. All right, we'll take a quick break, come back and talk about radical Islam versus mainstream Islam. Quick reminder, the podcast of Liberty Nation available to you from iTunes and other fine podcast providers. We'll be back.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
What we have heard here today has been a political spectacle.
We elect these guys to run the country. They're just not doing their job.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Radical Islam versus mainstream Islam. In the wake of another terrorist atrocity that killed at least 44 people at the largest airport in Turkey, comparable in scale to the Orlando attack, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and the rest of the leftists who refuse to utter the words radical Islam are back on their heels again, but sticking to their story that radical Islam really has nothing to do with Islam itself. So, is that true? Do most Muslims in the world support the jihad declared by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, or do they oppose it? Here to help us answer that question is Brigitte Gabriel, expert on national security and the rise of Islamic terrorism, as the founder and president of Act for America. Ms. Gabriel, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me with you. I'm delighted to join you.
Where is the dividing line between radical Islam and mainstream Islam?
Radical Islamists are basically devout Muslims following the Quran to the letter. They believe, like all Muslims believe, that Prophet Muhammad is the perfect man, and they try to emulate him and his actions. So, therefore, when we see the radicals read the Quran and follow the Quran to the letter and live it as it was lived and practiced during the days of Muhammad, we see the actions of people like ISIS. Moderate Islam is basically Muslims who either do not follow their religion, do not understand their religion, or are atheists, yet they call themselves Muslim by heritage. And according to the words of Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey, there's no such thing as moderate Islam or radical Islam. There is only one Islam. Islam is Islam. But the West has a very difficult time differentiating between the two, because we as a society have a very difficult time associating religion and politics into one, because in our cultures they're separate.
Our guest, Brigitte Gabriel, president of and founder of Act for America. Now, the president says he won't use the words radical Islam because it only strengthens the claims of the terrorists that they represent true Islam, and he refuses to give them that satisfaction. What do you make of that?
His opinion doesn't really matter to the terrorists nor their sympathizers, because the more he speaks like that, the more ISIS grows like wildfire. As a matter of fact, under his administration, which is very different than the administration of President Bush, who was very strong in fighting the radical Islamists worldwide, actually under President Bush, Al-Qaeda was truly on the run. Al-Qaeda, by the time President Bush left office, we had eliminated over 60% of the Al-Qaeda leadership. But under President Obama, who refused to call radical Islam by its name or even refused to associate any terrorism with Islam, we have seen an explosion worldwide by radical Islamists and their sympathizers, and these people who are gravitating towards the like of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and whatever any other terrorist group operating out there, because what's bringing the terrorists together is basically their ideology. And their ideology is the truth, regardless of the opinion of President Obama. And so actions speak louder than words. What's attracting these what we call radicals, these youth who are joining ISIS, is basically following the commandments of the Quran, that once the caliphate has been established, all Muslims must follow the caliphate and obey a caliph, because Islam divided the world into two: Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the house of war. And according to Islam, Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, will always be at war with Dar al-Harb, basically the house of non-Muslims, the house that has not been yet conquered by Islam. And so regardless of what the president believes, Muslims are following the commandments of the Quran, and that's why ISIS is very appealing to them.
You know, a Pew Research poll taken, it was about 3 years ago, showed that 82% of Egyptians, and now Egypt is considered one of the more mainstream Islamic nations, yet 82% of Egyptians believe that adulterers should be stoned, and 84% believe apostates from Islam should face the death penalty. 1 in 5 Egyptians believe that suicide bombings are sometimes or often justified. What are we to make of that?
Well, this is a reality check, and actually the reports you are referring to, the Pew Research, and obviously the Pew is not a conservative organization, the top 5 Islamic countries in the world, which they have interviewed, and that makes Bangladesh, Indonesia, Egypt, Pakistan, and Nigeria. 77% of people in those countries want Sharia law as the law of the land and want the establishment of an Islamic state. That Pew poll was taken in 2013. So Egypt was only one of the countries, because when people think of Indonesia, they think, oh, that Indonesians are just moderate people. That's the reality check, and that's what we need to pay attention to. And that's why, Tim, Americans must be mobilized and must come together to protect our America from the threat of radical Islam. And I encourage people to join us. Go to actforamerica.org. We are the largest national security grassroots organization in the country with 300,000 members and over 1,000 chapters nationwide. We are the NRA of national security. Go to actforamerica.org and join us today so together we can protect the country.
Ms. Gabriel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Brigitte Gabriel, national security and radical Islam expert. Take a quick break, then come back on the other side with Say What, how the left-wing media is spinning the Bill Clinton-Loretta Lynch meeting, how Donald Trump is breaking with Republican tradition in his economic policies, and on what we call enhanced interrogation techniques. We'll be back.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner. This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time. Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
Say What, the portion of Liberty Nation where we treat you or inflict upon you, depending on your perspective, some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. So we've been discussing today the now infamous secret, or so they thought, meeting between Bill Clinton and Loretta Lynch this week. So let's start things out by hearing the Attorney General's version of the meeting.
I did see the president at the Phoenix airport the other night. As I was landing, he was headed out. He did come over and say hello and speak to my husband and myself and talk about his grandchildren and his travels and things like that. So that was the extent of that.
It was just a spontaneous meeting. Unplanned, they say. But as Judge Andrew Napolitano said on Fox News, the very fact that they met and claimed it was just a coincidence they were in the same airport at the same time is beyond ridiculous.
Would this really have happened by coincidence, or would they have just talked about their grandchildren, as she said? Look, the Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the land. Her agents and lawyers, more than 100 of them, are engaged in 2 serious criminal investigations of Bill Clinton's wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton. It is inconceivable that she would permit herself to have any kind of contact with the husband of the target of a criminal investigation. The appearance of impropriety is so profound, no one could accept that she is now neutral in this case.
And yet the mainstream media just treated the meeting like it was nothing. Nothing to see. Here's Charlie Rose and John Heilman spinning it on CBS.
Her husband, the former president, and a meeting with Loretta Lynch, which seems on the face of it simply to be an innocent meeting of 2 politicians saying hello, but.
Yes, just not smart, right? Not a smart thing to do. You know, the case, she's still being investigated at the FBI. The Justice Department has jurisdiction over that case. You know, the president, former President Clinton, who usually has a really good fingertip feel for politics and for perception, just going and having the conversation, it just does him and his wife no good. So what's the point?
What's the point? What's the point? I mean, you're kidding, right? See, there's the spin. Gee, it wasn't smart. Now, we obviously know it was perfectly fine, but gee, they probably shouldn't have met because it doesn't look that good, even though they obviously did nothing wrong. So, would they think, for example, a powerfully connected defendant in a criminal case secretly meeting with the judge was perfectly okay? Perhaps they do. But the other big event the media had to cover this week was another terrorist jihadist attack on the largest airport in Turkey. 44 dead, as our president continues his refusal to use the phrase radical Islam.
The main contribution of some of my friends on the other side of the aisle have made in the fight against ISIL is to criticize this administration and me for not using the phrase radical Islam. We now have proposals from the presumptive Republican nominee for President of the United States to bar all Muslims from emigrating to America. And if we fall into the trap of painting all Muslims with a broad brush and imply that we are at war with an entire religion, then we are doing the terrorist work for them.
Right. That's the line. If we actually name the enemy, they'll use that to recruit more jihadists. So if you follow that logic, we never should have named Nazism as the enemy in World War II because those Nazis would probably lay off if we didn't name them. We should never have named communism as a blight on civilization because it might cause more people to become communists. See how that works? Now, Rudy Giuliani used another analogy on Fox News to say the president must use the phrase radical Islam.
I think it's an insult to the good Muslim people when you don't point out that this is a certain group of radical Muslims. They don't represent the good Muslim people. It's the same thing with the mafia. When I first used the word mafia, I was criticized by Italian Americans using the word mafia. And I said the best thing to do is to stand up against them and prove to them that they're only a small percentage of Italian Americans. And Muslims should stand up and demand that he use the words radical Muslim and say he can use those words, and we're not defensive about it because we're decent, honest, honorable people, and we hate those people who are acting that way.
But if the president's hatred of Donald Trump wasn't blazing hot already, it probably got even hotter this week when Trump answered reporters' questions by reiterating his support for the most controversial enhanced interrogation technique for starters.
They said, what do you think about waterboarding? I said, I like it a lot. I don't think it's tough enough. We have an enemy that's chopping off people's heads, Christians in particular, and drowning 30, 40, 50 people at a time in steel cages, right? Nobody's ever seen this before. This is like from the Middle Ages. We have to stop it. We have to be so strong. We have to fight so viciously and violently because we're dealing with violent people, vicious people.
That was the most explosive thing Trump said this week, but a close second was his renunciation of the traditional Republican view on trade in general and the yet-to-be-ratified Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, in particular.
Our friends in Britain recently voted to take back control of their economy, politics, and borders. Now it's time for the American people to take back their future. The TPP, as it's known, would be the death blow for American manufacturing. If we're going to deliver real change, we're going to have to reject the campaign of fear and intimidation being pursued by powerful corporations, media elites, and political dynasties.
Political dynasties, he said. Let me translate that for you. The Clintons. And Hillary Clinton, who said this about the TPP back in 2013.
This TPP sets the gold standard in trade agreements to open, free, transparent, fair trade.
But that was then, and this is now. And after pressure from the Bernie Sanders supporters, Hillary now says she is opposed to TPP, which, as Trump said, likely means she'd want to change a couple of sentences and say it's now all okay. But let me tell you, folks, we would be remiss if we left this Say What segment without playing for you the latest iteration of what we here call TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome, in the mainstream media. This from Nancy Giles, contributor to the CBS Sunday Morning Show.
He's, I think, clinically insane. I really do. I want to see more psychologists and psychiatrists evaluating him from a mental health point of view. He's, I think, clinically insane. I really do.
I'm sure she really does. I really am. Take a quick break and come back with Chewing the Fat.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner. This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Just talking loud, just say nothing, just say nothing, just say nothing.
And with that musical flourish, it's time to put a bow on the show by Chewing the Fat with Scott Cosenza, constitutional lawyer from one generation away, on the web at onegen.org. That's ONEGEN.org. Also on Facebook and Twitter, applying America's founding principles to the issues of today. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
And this week, the Supreme Court ended its handing down of decisions with a couple that were notable. We'll get to those in a moment, but first I need to get your impression. We've been talking a lot today about this meeting between Bill Clinton and Loretta Lynch. What I want you to do is tell me where I might be wrong, since you're the lawyer and I'm not, where the difference would lie between this and, say, an influential and powerful defendant in a trial meeting privately with the judge.
Well, Tim, typically the Attorney General meets with the spouses of high-level
people who are under investigation by the FBI. This is something that...
This is a good standard operating procedure. Okay, all right. Okay, my bad.
They choose the luncheon platter, whether you're going to go roast beef or maybe pizza.
A la carte or entree.
Right, it's catered. And what you just talked about with the defendant and the judge, it would just, to say that it would never happen, it's beyond the pale of inappropriateness and ridiculousness.
And if it did happen, the judge would automatically recuse himself or be...
Well, it wouldn't... It's almost like saying, what if there was a sexual relationship between the judge and the defendant? It's so far outside the bounds of anything that remotely considered appropriate. Now, in that case, though, this is somewhat less of a gross violation. I think that it is an abomination. I think
it's not a trial.
And I think General Lynch should step down because I think she has no credibility and evidenced a profound lack of sound judgment, which we must require in our Attorney General.
Step down from her position or step down from making a decision?
I think she should resign as Attorney General of the United States of America.
And there are certainly calls for a special prosecutor just to investigate this.
There have been formal calls. Now, Tom Fitton is the head of Judicial Watch. Now, you'll recall Judicial Watch is the great group that is the leader in these FOIA requests that started the ball rolling on this whole thing. Okay, right. And he has now asked the Justice Department, I think it's the Ethics Office Inspector General, to investigate this particular meeting and then issue, They have the power to issue sanctions and so forth on that. Now, of course, if you're the boss, like Loretta Lynch is, you can... maybe just do what you want. So
now they believe that this would be a secret, illicit meeting that none of us would find out about. And now that, thanks to, and again, I'm gonna shout out to them, ABC 15 in Phoenix, the local TV station, whose reporters uncovered this when the mainstream media was turned away, looking in the other direction, doing something else, or we would never know that the husband of the presumptive Democratic nominee and a former president of the United States had met with the woman who will ultimately decide whether or not to indict his wife.
You do those great journalists no favor by naming them, Tim. The letters of audits and all sorts of nastiness, I'm sure, are in the mail already to them for their sins against the administration.
All right, we've beaten this to death as much as we can this week. More to come, but let's go to the Supreme Court. 2 more decisions. Yet another one from Texas. It seems like every decision revolves around something in Texas, but we had a unanimous, I thought a surprisingly unanimous renunciation of the verdict in the Bob McDonnell, former governor of Virginia, corruption trial.
Yes, well, first to Texas. The whole case is Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt, and it's a 5-3 case. Sort of typical lines, Thomas, Alito, and Roberts dissenting, and the bloc, the remainders voting to strike down this Texas law that basically required facilities that wanted to conduct abortions to have...
And by the way, Justice Kennedy was part of the bloc, of the 5-person bloc. So again, he's the swing vote. And again, he votes in a way that makes it impossible to know what, if any, judicial philosophy he really has.
Yeah. So this case, basically, Texas put up some legislation that required facilities that wanted to have abortions to have all these onerous sort of surgical add-ons that basically the entirety of the legislation was to frustrate women who wanted to have an abortion. They called it a health something or other, and that's what they do. But I think it's appropriate that when the Supreme Court says, no matter what you feel about whether abortion should be legal or not, or is a fundamental right in America, as the Supreme Court has said, once there is a right established, like the Supreme Court says abortion is, I don't think it behooves the opponents of that to basically try to nibble around the edges, which is what they've done here.
In other words, what you're saying is that Roe versus Wade, whether you like it or not, is the law of the land, and therefore to deliberately thwart the intent of that ruling by the Supreme Court in 1973 should be met with...
I think you're exactly
the kind
right
of result
with that.
You're talking about there.
Yeah, okay. That's what I think. And I think even though in this case the conservative bloc of the court voted to see that law upheld, I think you could make a conservative case for that. So a conservative case, in other words, to support striking down this abortion restriction with the vein that if a right has been deemed a fundamental right, a constitutionally guaranteed right, the way to attack it then is by a constitutional amendment or appointing justices on the Supreme Court who disagree with that.
Am I not wrong? But those who opposed this decision, those in the pro-life movement, are claiming that all that Texas is doing is applying the same standards to abortion clinics that they are to other women's health providers who do not include abortion among their services.
I think that's right. I would say, though, when we know that your purpose, and it's in the record, the purpose is to frustrate abortion services. That's the law is not ignorant, or the law
but that requires reading somebody's mind. I mean, you can't
the legislative intent. Legislative intent is something that is looked at in the record of almost all these sorts of reviews of controversial legislation. So intent is looked into by the court. So let me just move on, rather than consume the whole segment with that, to McDonald versus United States.
Let's do that.
This was an 8-0 unanimous decision by the Supreme Court. Our former governor, McDonald, was convicted. I think it was 11 felony counts.
Convicted of politics.
Yeah, well,
as is pretty much what they said.
Well, he was dirty dealing, okay? He was taking money and giving favors. And the question before the court was, were those favors a violation of federal law in the sense that they constituted an official act? And basically what the government's position was almost anything that Bob McDonald did for these people that gave him money was an official act. So just picking up the phone, if I accept a phone call from somebody who gave me money, that's an official act because I'm the governor and that's part of, or if I set up a meeting, that's an official act. The court said absolutely not, that an official act must involve a formal exercise of government power. And you can imagine just picking up a phone does not, or scheduling a meeting and hosting maybe even a luncheon at the governor's mansion, all these sorts of...
and there's no evidence that any of that took place.
Not in a quid. There is evidence that those meetings took place, but not official acts.
Not as official acts of government.
Under the standard that the Supreme Court has articulated in this unanimous decision, I don't believe there is any evidence that Governor McDonald did, in fact, do official acts on behalf of his supporters.
I might add, too, that those of us here in Virginia were absolutely stunned at this charge, at the indictment, and certainly at the conviction of Bob McDonald, because he has his flaws like anyone else, but being corrupt never appeared to be one of them. So this is a big victory for those who support Bob McDonald, and we shall we say consistency under the law. But I want to get
and Hillary can breathe a lot easier too with this ruling, Tim.
Yeah,
they can start selling out the Lincoln bedroom right now.
Yeah.
Book early for
early and often.
I hear that the White House Christmas tree is particularly nice.
Yeah,
right.
For sale again. All right, now we've often talked here about how getting a wiretap request is not all that difficult, but little did we know that in 2015 the percentage of wiretap requests that were actually rejected was 0%.
The number was zero. Forget about the percentage.
The number
was zero.
Yeah.
We have a report released today from basically the U.S. Supreme Court Administrative Agency, which issues reports on wiretap requests, and we have the report from 2015. There were 4,148 wiretaps requested. Now, this is not just in federal courts. This includes state courts as well. Every single one of the 4,148 wiretap requests was granted by the judge. And we also know from an earlier report that was released that all 1,457 requests from the NSA and FBI before the FISA court were granted. So in all the ways that policing agencies can request wiretaps in these United States, every single one of them was granted. Now, you could say, with a straight face, if you could say that those agencies are just conservative and don't ask for these permissions unless they have more than an abundance of probable cause and exhaustion. Both of those things have to be in place. So you have to have probable cause that the evidence you're seeking, which is to say the conversations here, will result, in valuable evidence gathering, and that you've exhausted less invasive means to discover that evidence, right? So you can't say, hey, look, I know that guy's a drug dealer. Let me go bug his phone. It's like, well, maybe you should just follow him around, for a week and see what happens. So we talk about the death of the Fourth Amendment a lot, and this doesn't argue too favorably against that proposition.
So this is collectively the judge's version of don't ask, don't tell. Don't ask us. They say, don't ask us why we really need this, and they say, we won't tell you not to do it. All right. Thank you, Scott. Happy 4th.
Thank you, Tim. Same to you. Happy Independence Day, everybody.
Happy Independence Day, and thank you for joining us. Happy birthday, America. We've run out of time this week, but we'll be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation.